The World Economic Forum is probably best known for its annual meeting of business and political leaders in Davos, Switzerland, but it is also a thought leader on the delivery and the consequences of the fourth industrial revolution. And we are delighted to welcome to Global Solutions from the Managing Board of the World Economic Forum, Richard Samans.
Thank you, Declan, and good afternoon, everyone, and congratulations to both Dennis and Dirk for really running the best T20 process in history, as far as I'm aware. I've been invited, our institution has been invited to reflect a bit upon some of the big issues that have underscored, run beneath a lot of the discussions over the last 2 days. A lot of discussion about populism, protectionism, political polarization. And of course, the G20 is the self-described premier forum for international economic cooperation, so it's altogether appropriate to reflect upon what all of this political ferment means for economic policy and indeed for the growth model. Let me suggest that a good place to start in this regard is to acknowledge that there has been a certain complacency in leadership, and yes, indeed, even in think tank and economic policy research circles, about the human impact of the technological disruption, international economic integration, domestic deregulation, and migration of recent decades. If you will, that's like sort of a quadruple cocktail of economic change. And there's a certain human cost or effect of that. And that doesn't necessarily show up, I think, all the time in our mental models of economic growth and our public discourse. We have been invited to offer a few thoughts on that, and that's in the paper that Declan just referred to. But obviously, much of that churn has contributed significantly to what you might think of as secular dispersion over the last couple of decades. And part of acknowledging our complacency about that human dimension is openly recognizing that the dominant growth model paradigm of the last couple of decades, broad-based progress in living standards, really has been, maybe subliminally or implicitly, a byproduct of economic policy and growth. It's not been really thought about or viewed as an element of the growth process, let alone an important source of growth itself. And I think that fundamental point is part of the price of admission for politicians on the one hand, and us, the economic policy establishment writ large on the other, to be taken more seriously by the public, which is feeling a lot of these dimensions. Now, just pause for a second on that. I think most of us, maybe all of us, would agree that economic growth can be thought of as a top-line concept, if I can borrow a business analogy. The bottom-line measure by which societies assess the success of their country's economic performance is not growth per se, but it is the extent to which broad-based progress in living standards has been achieved. That is a non-trivial difference. Growth, top-line, broad living standards is really the bottom line from a social or political economy standpoint. But I think it's fair to conclude that the political polarization we see today is a sign of a drop in public confidence that we have it right, that we have the hierarchy of priorities right in this regard, after decades of this kind of change and disruption. If you think that the global economic integration of the last couple of decades and the digitization and other technological change during that period has really been a potent cocktail for this type of ferment politically and socially, then think about the next 20 years of technological disruption, which appears to be coming down the track. We at the Forum call this the fourth industrial revolution, but it's the rapid acceleration and increased intertwining of a number of advanced technologies, which many analysts suggest is only going to increase the velocity of this change and whatnot. So it creates, if you will, an even greater imperative, it seems to me, for those of us who are in political office and taking decisions on the one hand, and those of us supporting them on the other, to think about how to address that more specifically. So how to reinforce that public confidence? First, I would suggest, is to take measures to dispel this implicit complacency by the nature of the mental model we've been using for economic progress over the last couple of decades. A little bit of public humility and narrative signaling that maybe we don't quite have the right mental wiring on this, I think would go a long way. As I said, it's sort of the initial price of admission for some of the folks who have been at the front lines of this change and disruption to hear that, in fact, the message has gotten through. Yes, macroeconomic discipline, openness, flexibility in markets, entrepreneurial zest, and enabling environment conditions, these are all absolutely still highly relevant and important. But in the face of this rolling political dialogue and this degree of social unrest, if we simply rehearse those necessary but not sufficient elements of our mental map, our growth model, if you will, in my view, we just lengthen the distance between that degree of public confidence on the one hand and the leadership direction that our politicians and policy analysts seek to drive. So simply asking the question, as I think we just heard our Argentinian Sherpa indicate, what would it look like if we placed people at the center of economic policy? What would be the shakeout from a standpoint of political policy priorities if we put median living standards, we address that more explicitly as, if you will, the policy anchor here, as the bottom line? Simply asking those questions and fostering public discourse about it, I think would go part way, a significant way, toward getting the attention of society more generally in this regard. But it's one thing to show through narrative signaling that leaders get it and are moving beyond business as usual. It's another thing to have a credible, specific response, a policy prescription in this regard. And here we have laid out in this paper 3 specific elements, which I will very briefly summarize. First, I mean, broadly speaking, if I could put a cap on it overall, it's to explicitly design social inclusion to innovation ecosystems, on the one hand, national economic and international economic policy, secondly, and then specifically within that policy, human capital formation and labor markets. We lay out a specific set of policy suggestions in each. On the first, it's mainly to recognize that to design ex ante, or in process, social considerations into technological systems, you've got to have an informal, interactive, multi-stakeholder process of dialogue on that. And we at the Forum have set up a center in San Francisco, the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is intended to serve as an international platform for that kind of informal governance dialogue. Secondly, with respect to economic policy, to design it or hardwire social inclusion into the growth model itself means fundamentally to recognize a lot of the work that's gone on over the last decades or so in recognizing the importance of institutional strength and both demand and supply side elements of structural economic policy for getting the pattern of growth right from the standpoint of society, but indeed, as the IMF and the OECD's research has demonstrated in the last few years, it actually can be a tonic for growth itself. And we lay out in our Inclusive Growth and Development report we issued in January of this year 15 different areas of structural policy and institutional strength in various sectors of the economy that are potential win-wins for both growth and inclusion, for finding that synergy between the two, and we lay out a cross-country database so that countries can assess where they're relatively strong and weak relative to their peer group of countries in those institutional domains. Viewing that structural and institutional ecosystem as an ecosystem, rather than looking at just one piece of it, education on the one hand or social insurance on the other, is the key to beginning to shift the growth model, to elevate institutions to the same level as the traditional preoccupation of finance ministers, which is macroeconomic policy and financial supervision on the one hand, and trade ministers on the other. If we rebalanced our mental map and our policy priorities in that regard, we would go a long way in this regard. And linked to that is a series of implications for international economic policy as well. And I'll end with one specific pointed challenge in this regard. It's anomalous, in my view, for there to be so much discussion about protectionism and so often an observation that we need to do more to help the losers, if you will, of the process. And yet, on the other hand, see a continuing absence of a commitment to invest substantially more in both the equity of access and quality of education and training and other aspects of human capital on the one hand, and labor markets on the other, modernization of labor markets on the other. This is crying out for a specific agenda. We lay out a range of specific areas where there is this anomaly. We provide some cross-country data in that regard, and I'll just give you one tangible illustration of this. I'm an American. You know what's happening in the United States. You've seen what's happened to the trade debate. And yet the U.S. invests about 0.1% of GDP in active labor market policies. That's to say training and labor adjustment, which is 1/6 of the OECD average, 1/8 of the German commitment in this regard, and about 1/10 or 1/12 of what the small Nordic countries do. That disconnect, that anomaly, is just an illustration of what we could redress by changing this hierarchy and our thinking about how we organize economic progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you.